Good evening and welcome to episode 9 of COP28 Covered, the most popular climate podcast on the planet right now, brought to you from the very heart of the climate summit here in Dubai. It's Friday the 5th of December and we're back after a very brief rest day here at COP, although not much rest was had. And I say we, but it is just me, Edie's publisher Luke Nichols, running the show today because Matt and Sarah have returned home to the winter wonderland that is the UK. But rest assured, I've got a very special edition of the show to bring you today because we'll be shining the Edie spotlight on today's COP theme of youth, children, education and skills. We've got exclusive interviews with the Race to Zero and the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. Plus, I've just bumped into the internationally renowned climate scientist Johan Rockström for a fascinating chat which we're going to be bringing you an excerpt of. And of course, Sarah's going to be bringing us another edition of What's Hot and What's Not from today's announcements, and maybe even another listener quiz for the day. All of that's coming up in today's episode of COP28 Covered. Yes, welcome back to COP28 Covered, hosted in collaboration with the UN's Race to Zero campaign, who we'll be hearing from a bit later on in the show. It's been a few days since you heard my voice here on the pod because episode 8 saw Sarah and Matt take the reins whilst I went and had a fancy dinner with the likes of COP26 President Alok Sharma. And then we had our so-called rest day here at COP, which gave everyone a few hours to take stock and prepare for this crucial final run-in of the climate summit, which is due to end on Tuesday, the 12th of December, all going to plan. And that brings us to now, because I am back within the buzz of the Blue Zone. The evening is drawing in around us right now, and I'm currently sat on a lovely park bench like an old man here on one of the side paths here at the expo venue. You can possibly hear the background music of the now famous Al Wasl Dome, along with the hum of various delegates and negotiators passing by in the background, including 3 people in business attire who I've just seen physically running between pavilions behind me. I'm not sure if that's a good sign or a bad sign, we shall see. And like I say, it is just me around the podcast mic this evening. Matt and Sarah touched back down in the UK yesterday evening, although both are still very much on the front lines here at COP when it comes to Edie's editorial coverage, because they are tuning into the various sessions remotely and even posthumously delivering up some of the segments of this show, because Sarah being Sarah, she has managed to pre-record a couple of interviews here before she flew home, which has made my life a lot easier, and so I'm going to be weaving a few of those interviews into the next couple of episodes of. And that's not all, because Sarah has also promised us her usual What's Hot and What's Not segment of the show, and I think actually I'm going to start right there to help set the scene for today's episode, because it has been another huge day of activity here at COP, with the main theme of the day being youth, children, education and skills. And so, by the power of podcasting magic, I'm going to hand over to Sarah right now to round up the biggest announcements and developments of the day, followed by one or two things that perhaps haven't been announced or have sparked some controversy or backlash here. So, to give us her What's Hot and What's Not of COP28, here's Sarah back in the UK, who I'm assuming has swapped out the pink power suit for a woolly Christmas jumper.
Yes, as you mentioned, Luke, as the negotiations at COP continue to hot up, Matt and I are very much cooling down. We landed back in the UK yesterday and it was a chilly 6 degrees and pouring it down with rain, because of course it was. So you'd be right for assuming that I am indeed wearing a jumper at the moment, but I'm saving my special reindeer one with bells and whistles for Christmas Eve. Even while we're apart, I've been keeping an eye on all of the happenings at COP28 online, using our great network of experts who are kindly answering their WhatsApps and their emails, even though I'm sure they're run off their feet on the ground in Dubai. So here we go with What's Hot and What's Not at COP 8th of December. So what's hot is that a fossil fuel phase out is still on the table. An updated global stock text is out today, and it includes 2 wording options for a complete fossil fuel phase-out. It also includes 2 options for phasing out unabated fuels, but importantly, both of these emphasise a reduction in their use in the near time. There is still a no-text option though, but the UN climate chief Simon Steele has really encouraged countries today not to compromise on ambition and not to leave blank holes in the text. Secondly, in terms of what's hot at COP, a group of hundreds of business and climate leaders have sent a joint leader to the COP28 presidency team, calling on them to ensure that the final negotiated texts are aligned with 1.5C. There were 800 backers initially for this open letter, which was convened by the B team, but this has grown in less than a day to exceed 900 signatories. The letter's key asks include an unambiguous agreement to a fossil fuel phase-out and a commitment to halt and reverse deforestation this decade per the UN Biodiversity Treaty ratified last December. Signatories of the letter include Paul Polman, Mary Robinson, Cristiano Figueres and London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Thirdly and finally, we are expecting the outcomes for the youth stocktake, the centrepiece of youth advocacy for COP28. More than 750,000 young people from 160 nations have contributed to this. It essentially scrutinises the UNFCCC processes and looks at where youth's voices could be better embedded and amplified. More on the full thing in today's daily roundup on the website. So that brings us on to what's not hot at COP. I mean, obviously it's Matt and I in the UK, but what's not hot in Dubai is the number of business attendees that clearly just want to undermine a strong agreement or have been ambivalent either way. An analysis of the corporate attendee list for COP28 has revealed that 9 in 10 big businesses present are either lobbying against progressive climate-related policy shifts or are disengaged with green policy. This is according to an analysis from Influence Map. It fleshes out claims from Kick Polluters Out made earlier in the summit that there are almost 2,500 fossil fuel lobbyists registered for COP28, compared with just 500 climate scientists. Influence Map has revealed today that businesses including Gazprom, ExxonMobil and Chevron have all sent more than 10 staff to COP28, which is of concern because their direct and indirect lobbying activities have served to block progressive green policy changes in the past and continue to do so. European oil and gas majors including Shell, Equinor, Total Energies and Eni have also sent significant contingents, say Influence Map. So that's been your brief what's hot and what's not to COP. Back to Luke on the ground in Dubai.
Great stuff. Thank you, Sarah. And all of those announcements are once again covered on the ed.net website. And we'll be hearing again from Sarah at the end of the show. Now, let's crack on with this packed episode then, because we've got 2 youth-themed interviews to bring you to tie in with today's theme. But actually, I'm going to go a bit off-menu for our first interview segment, because just before coming on air, I was making my way between the zones here at the Expo, and walking alongside me was none other than the leading climate scientist that is Johan Rockström. I'm sure many of our listeners will be well aware of the work and speeches of Rockström. He's played a pivotal role in the inclusion of climate science in international negotiations, and certainly doesn't hold any punches when talking about the real urgency for governments and businesses to act on climate change. And so what an opportunity, I thought, to grab 5 minutes with him, which ended up actually being 10 minutes for an exclusive video interview. That video interview is live on the site right now, but I thought this was such a great chat that it warranted inclusion on today's pod as well, because I got Johan's take on the current state of play here at COP with regards to this phase out or phase down of fossil fuels, and his take on that is really interesting. And we also discussed the corporate net zero transition, and Johan gives us some great business advice, which is really worth a listen. So here's an extract from my chat with Johan Rockström, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, in full. Johan, thanks so much for joining us at sudden short notice. We're talking at a great time. We're in the final run-in for this COP. The talk now is really about phase down or phase outs of fossil fuels. How important is it that this is the COP that we see a phase out of fossil fuels?
You know, ever since the last COP, we've been in very intensive discussions with this COP presidency, with the United Nations Framework Convention, that this is the moment to really take the mitigation agenda seriously. It's the first COP hosted by an oil and gas nation. The presidency is held by the CEO of a state oil and gas company. It's therefore a great responsibility to really convene and get a plan for the phase out of fossil fuel. So get a credible, so not only a statement on phase down or phase out. I would argue that that's kind of an academic question today. What we need is a really concrete plan of what happens between now and 2025, when we need to bend the global curve of emissions. What happens between 25 and 2030, when we need to cut global emissions by half and reduce emissions with a pace of 6 to 7% per year for all fossil fuels globally, and then cut emissions by half every decade to reach a point by 2050, which basically has a full phase out of coal, but still certainly will have a phase down of oil and gas, because we have so many difficult to abate industries that then needs to be compensated with carbon dioxide removal. We have provided numerous scientific technical notes into the negotiations on exactly this matter, spelling out what the IPCC, then the Governmental Panel on Climate Change says. So I think we are really clear today scientifically what needs to happen on this pathway. 2050 is a milestone. That's not the end of it. The key is to recognize that we're talking about full phase out, but if that phase out occurs 2050 or 2055 or 2060 is secondary. The key is to cut global emissions for all fossil fuels by half by 2030. Why? Well, because scientifically we know that holding 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a target or a goal, it's a physical limit. Go beyond it and we risk not only unmanageable impacts from climate extremes like droughts, floods, fires and disease on millions of people around the world, but also that we risk crossing tipping points, causing irreversible damage to the life support on planet Earth. So it's a really hard limit, and it translates to a carbon budget, which was released here just 2 days ago, the 2023 update. We only have 250 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining that we can allow ourselves to emit from fossil fuel burning and land use change to have a 50% chance of holding 1.5. And that is such a minuscule budget, and everything that counts is the area under the curve. So the pathway can be calculated, and that's the pathway that takes us to 50% by 2030. So, phase out or phase down is, of course, a question that needs to be sorted here in Dubai. But what we expect, and what I think everyone here should expect, is a plan. And that plan has to be not a one-sentence plan, it has to be a 2-page plan which spells out what should happen in regions, in sectors, for the 3 different fuels: oil, coal and gas. And how do you do it in a way that not only follows the pace that science stipulates is necessary, 6-7% per year of decline, but also how do you actually mobilize not only the finance to enable that transition technologically and economically, but how do you enable a soft landing? How do you ensure that the vast majority of economies around the world don't collapse on this journey? We know that once we're out of this gauntlet, this period of transition, we are very likely to be winners, that the world comes out with a cleaner, more efficient, cheaper, economically more competitive energy system. But the transition will be challenging, undoubtedly, and it will be challenging also because we have delayed so much that the speed by which this has to happen is so high now. But that's where we are, and that's what COP28 is really fundamentally about, getting that credible mitigation plan.
Thank you. You answered most of my questions that I had there. The only other one I had was really bringing this back round to business. A lot of EDI's community have, over the last couple of years, established net zero targets, fairly ambitious net zero targets. I wanted to get your thoughts on the concept of net zero generally, because from the scientific community there's some backlash against net zero. It maybe is a little bit disconnected from the real ambitions that we need to see here. And again, to your point about maybe a lack of actual concrete plans, we're seeing that a little bit with businesses. What's your take on the kind of net zero movement and where it stands at the moment?
Yeah, so just like fossil fuel phase out or phase down, net zero, absolute zero is something that it is quite murky and grey, and my conclusion is that it is murky and grey just because the realities are complicated. I wish I could say that all science shows unequivocally that we need to reach absolute zero. It would be the simplest, most straightforward message. But the reality is that if you cut something by half every decade, there will be a residual by 2050. And that residual is feedstocks in industry from natural gas. It is the need to use natural gas for difficult to abate industries, but also recognizing its use in fertilizer production. You will have some residual parts of the economy that still run on fossil fuels by 2050. So there is an argument to be made that net zero, even though it creates this opens a door for misuse, there is very little evidence that you can entirely kind of omit it. But there's a simple way of dealing with this, which is to create different carbon account buckets. So you have one carbon account bucket, which is the remaining carbon budget, the 250 billion tons of carbon dioxide that we can allow ourselves to emit for an orderly phase out. Then you have the carbon bucket on carbon dioxide removal technologies, the technologies that need to be invested in industry to take out, to compensate for the difficult to abate, the net zero part. So by 2050, there will be a special carbon accounting. There should be a special carbon accounting. If you have still 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide in oil and gas, you have to take that out so that you are at net zero by 2050. But then you have a third technological carbon account, which is, we know that you also have to start scaling different forms of negative emission technologies so that the whole world economy becomes a negative sucks up more than it emits. That is well beyond the net zero point. So it's not about compensating oil and gas and coal that is still out there. It is about really sucking out in an absolute way, so that we enter the second half of this century is a net absorber of carbon. We're sucking out carbon. And then finally, there's a whole bucket on nature. And that bucket should be kept apart. So you cannot use tree planting or regenerative agriculture as a way of saying that's what helps me to get to net zero. So I continue my oil and gas emissions, and then I compensate for that by planting trees. That does not work, because the climate models that gives us bucket one, the fossil fuel remaining carbon budget, the models have already assumed that nature will provide a carbon sink of roughly 50% of what we are emitting. So that bucket is already accounted for. It's already factored in. We simply need to deliver that one and the phase out bucket. So net zero, yes, for some residual, additional technologies needed to suck that out, but we also need to scale negative emission technologies, and we need to take care of nature, and we have to do everything simultaneously. And then anyone who listens to this will say, oh my God, that sounds like overly complex. Well, I can just say, dear friends, the planet is a complex system, and we have created havoc to an extent that we now need so much repair that it's time to recognize that we need to work along all these lines of action, and that there are multiple carbon budgets that need to be respected. You cannot offset them against each other. So it's not so simple to say, I dislike net zero, so therefore I'm simply against it. One has to go into the details and recognize that some part of abatement will be required.
Johan, thank you so much. I know you need to run. I have literally stopped you on the way to one of your many events you're speaking at, so thank you so much. I'll see who else I can bump into here at COP28. Yeah, fascinating chat there with Johan. Really appreciated him taking the time to chat with us, as apparently he was due on stage literally a few minutes after we spoke there. Such is the nature of these COPs. So that's been a great scene setter, I think, for our two themed interviews of the show, because that theme of the day here is youth. There are currently 1.8 billion young people between the ages of 10 to 24 on this planet, the largest youth generation in history. And this is a generation that is increasingly vocal and aware of the risks being posed by the climate crisis, because they're the ones that are actually going to be living through its impacts across the globe. So there have been many great talks and discussions happening across the day here, and also the past couple of days in fact, because we have two interviews to play you now. I think I'll play them back to back, but they weren't both done by me, because before heading home, Sarah was able to sit down here with Karim Salah, who is a fellow of the UN's Race to Zero campaign, which Edie is of course partnered with as an official accelerator, and Karim was previously a member of the COP27 Youth Task Force. So this is someone who has played a pivotal role in shaping global climate policies and youth engagements throughout the COP process. And then we're going to go from Sarah's chat with Karim onto another fascinating chat that I had earlier today over in the Children and Youth Pavilion with Mamadou Sylla. And I must say, Mamadou is one of the most inspirational people I've met here at this COP so far, because he's an advocacy working group coordinator for the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, and he's also a student who is currently studying for his exams. So this is a great real-life example of a young person who is really taking the lead on efforts to drive positive change and mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis whilst going through their own development and education. And I think that's enough of an introduction to both interviews, so let's play them back to back now. Here's Sarah's chat with Race to Zero fellow Karim Salah, followed by my chat with Mamadou Sylla from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition in full.
Yes, so for this next part of the podcast, it's great to be catching up with a representative of the Race to Zero, who we have partnered with to host this daily show from COP28. I'm here with Karim, who is their first ever youth fellow, and also has past experience on the COP27 Youth Task Force. So I'm sure a great source of knowledge and inspiration for today's topic. So Karim, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me, and it's my pleasure. And looking forward for the podcast.
Of course. And I was going to ask to start with about this youth fellowship from Race to Zero. So why is it so important for them to have youth fellows, and what does your work as a youth fellow look like? What does it entail?
Okay, so just to make things clear, I'm not the first youth fellow in the Climate Champions, but the first in the Race to Zero campaign, because we have a fellowship program. I definitely urge all the audience to check it. It's very nice, and I'm the first one for the Race to Zero campaign. To be honest, it has been a life-changing experience, and what I always like to call is the perfect balance between learning and contributing. Because for me personally, I don't like to be in a place where I'm just contributing or offering. That means that I'm not growing. And the other way around, which is I'm only learning, I'm not like contributing anything. It doesn't feel like very beneficiary for the other party. So I think I've got that perfect balance. Usually one of the biggest challenges that we face as youth is, specifically after we graduate or after we start seeking for jobs, is to find the suitable jobs that require that we can contribute to, because most of them would require experience to start, and then you would not be able to start anything without prior experience if you just graduated. So I think this program really offers a venue for these youth that can contribute to be able, as I said, to learn and add value to the team at the same time. And I hope that my experience this year will not close the door for the other fellowship opportunities in the future, but to be honest, the team has given me a lot of room to contribute and to add value to the team. So yeah, I'm very thankful for it, and I really think it's a huge opportunity for youth specifically interested in this field.
And I'm sure we can talk about employment, education and skills and what happens beyond COP a bit later. But in terms of the actual buzz around COP, I wanted to get your feel as someone that was involved with youth at COP27. I wanted to get your view on how the youth presence here compares with what you saw in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Okay. So I will first start by giving context on what happened for youth engagement in Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27, because I was working with the presidency in the COP27 Youth Task Force. And usually in most of the COPs that happened before, there was huge criticism on the youth engagements and representation in the COPs. I remember even in COP26, Obama said in the negotiations rooms, like, look at all of the, like, probably 196 countries present. There is like not more than 2 youth present in the room. So it was hugely criticized, the presence of youth in the previous COPs. So it was really nice that we have seen a very clear interest and inclusion of the youth in the COP27 process, with very first evers that happened, starting with the first ever COP27 Youth Envoy, and that role was renewed this year for the COP28 Climate Champion, Youth Climate Champion. We also had the first ever Youth and Children Pavilion. We had the first ever Youth Thematic Day, Youth and Future Generation Thematic Day. And we have many youth participating in the party negotiators with their country. And I'm also glad to be part of this program for Egypt this year. So to be honest with you, things escalated quickly when we talk about youth engagement, and I'm not complaining at all. That's amazing, because we have been like talking and like, we really want youth engagement. We really want to be present at the discussion table. We want more youth opportunities. So I think we are definitely way beyond satisfactory, but we are, I think, at a much better rate than I imagined.
That makes sense. I mean, we see a lot about COPs trying to promote youth inclusion in tokenistic ways. So maybe there'll be a themed agenda day, but as you say, youth won't go into the negotiating rooms or have their chance to present things to people going into the negotiating room. So if we've got young people that are listening that want to influence the negotiations or even get in that room, what routes are there really?
So there is 2 ways. There is bottom-up approach and top-down approach. Top-down is you join the party delegation of your country, but that's not very much in your hand. That depends on the decision of the country delegation. But I think you should start advocating, see what ministry is sending the delegation for COP, and try to reach out to them and tell them how can you add value, how it is important to have youth inclusion. I think there is already a lot of influence from the international community for delegations to have youth. So that's one of the top down approach. And for the other bottom up approach is start from the grassroots really, like starting from NGOs, CSOs, like make pressure on the negotiators to include your voice. I remember actually listening to like I don't want to mention a specific name, but one of the lead negotiators that was focusing on the loss and damage fund that actually was agreed on last year in COP. And he said that it wasn't actually an option for us whether to talk about loss and damage or to include it or not, because he said that, I remember in Bonn, there was huge demonstrations even inside the big conference hall. So that was youth, that was civil society, that was bottom-up approach. So make your voice heard, be loud, and yeah, I think now we have much more opportunity than ever.
I mean, technically, as UN soil, or protests aren't allowed in the blue zone, but that hasn't stopped them going ahead. I've seen so many of them there, and one thing that they all have in common is that there's always young people taking part, and that's great to see. But Kareem, I wanted to come back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is that COPs are just 2 weeks out of the year, and beyond that we need to create lasting legacies for youth. And something you mentioned was having good and accessible youth employment in green economies, having well-paid jobs that are accessible to those that are taking on their first jobs. So beyond COPs, what can be done to create these jobs and promote them, make sure that people are aware of them and ready to work in them?
Okay, this is this is a very good question, and funny enough, I have a session right after this podcast on green jobs in the Children and Youth Pavilion. So first off, we need to talk about it. And what we are doing now is definitely part of the starting the solution. We can have a lot of criticism on the process, on the lack of opportunities, but having that is better than not even having it on the table. So for me, it starts with the education first. You need to include climate and sustainability in education, because on the long-term investment, if you're investing on these youth and educating them what is the concept of sustainability, what is the concept of green economy and climate change, they will integrate that when they grow up in their in the economy and in their jobs. But for now, we must ensure a seamless transition from the old economy to the new economy. We don't want it to be like a lot of people, specifically when we talk about just transition, those that are most vulnerable. Let's say the workers that work in the steel industry or the workers that work in the fossil fuels industry. These, I think, are the ones that will be in the forefront of facing the change from the old ways of work to the new ways. So we must ensure inclusion for them and opportunities and capacity building for them to be able to transfer from the old jobs to the green jobs that will be available. So again, reiterating, starting from schools and universities, capacity buildings for the people that are already working and need to transition, and definitely having more opportunity from the big companies for the youth.
Yeah, we've seen this before, so it's not just about skilling people and educating them in the first place, but also upskilling and reskilling them as well. So Kareem, I think that's sadly all the time we have. I could talk to you all day about these topics. It's been fantastic to speak to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks a lot for having me, and for all the audience, enjoy your day.
Yes, thank you very much for that chat, Sarah. And we move straight on to our second conversation for this youth-themed episode of COP28 Covered, because I am sat, rather fittingly, inside the Children and Youth Pavilion here within the blue zone of COP. There are loads of lively and active discussions going on around us right now, but I'm pleased to be joined here on the sidelines by Mamadou, who is an environmental activist from Senegal and an advocacy working group coordinator for the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, among various other roles. Mamadou, hello. Thanks so much for joining us. Perhaps you could just start by explaining your role and the work that you do with the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here in the podcast. I'm very much happy to be here. So our coalition was founded after the COP in Copenhagen, and basically what we do, it's advocacy around advocacy, but then not only advocacy, we have storytelling, capacity building, but the general idea, the general goal in which the coalition was founded was basically to raise public awareness on the issue of loss and damage, but also to pressure and lobby governments and stakeholders so that they can take ambitious actions to address loss and damage.
Yeah, it's a really interesting campaign, and one which I feel, I guess, sits really at that kind of crucial intersection of government and funding and indigenous communities and, of course, youth. Now, I'll come on to the youth point in a moment, but I'm keen to dig a little bit more into the loss and damage element of this COP, because we, of course, had that notable breakthrough very early on in this summit with the Loss and Damage Fund being agreed at that opening plenary, in fact. Under that fund, essentially, wealthy countries most responsible for the climate emergency pledged a combined total of just over $700 million or £556 million towards the irreversible economic and non-economic losses that developing countries are facing from global warming every year. That sounds like a lot of money on the face of it, but many are saying this actually falls way short of what's actually needed. Some reports are suggesting it's the equivalent of less than 0.2% of the true costs of loss and damage caused by climate change. Mamadou, what did you make of the loss and damage announcement?
Yeah, I mean, we really have a mitigated feeling on the announcement. Of course, we are very happy that we have a fund for communities to rely on in case of losses and damages. And for someone who is familiar with the negotiations on loss and damage, this is really a very historic breakthrough, because for over 30 years we have been running around countries to tell them that loss and damage is here and that we need to support vulnerable communities to face these losses and damages induced by climate change. For 30 years we have been running behind that, and unfortunately it's only last year at COP27 that we had the commitment from parties to establish a funding mechanism for loss and damage, and throughout the whole year, the transitional committee which was set at COP27 was meeting to discuss the details of the fund, and their recommendations were adopted at day one of COP28, which we are very happy about. But of course there are a lot of things that we are not happy about how the discussions has went. First of all, there is the fact that the money is not sufficient. There's a lot of enthusiasm now about the fund, and then some countries are pledging, but this pledge compared to the losses and damages that are happening, that are estimated to be over 400 billions, this is just like peanuts basically when we compare to the needs of the populations. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is no liability to the fund. It's like just based on voluntary pledges. For the moment, you can see our idea of the fund was that countries that have been historically contributing to the climate change with their historical emissions should be the ones leading in putting a lot of money on the fund as compensation to vulnerable countries who have done the least to cause the climate crisis. Unfortunately, some of the countries, like the United States, for instance, have participated just very, very little money, and this is just based on voluntary, which we think is not really right, because this fund should not be just like a simple fund. It's a fund for justice, because the countries that have done the least to cause the climate crisis are suffering from the losses and damages, and we just do them justice when we support them to face these losses and damages.
Yeah, and I think the other key element of this is that these loss and damage funds should be new and additional, right? And they should come as actual grants rather than loans. But in many cases, like the UK's, who I think pledged around £60 million worth, I think that commitment is neither new nor additional, as it was effectively taken from existing and recently downgraded finance pledges. I want to talk about what needs to happen next then, Mamadou, to really turn the dial on this conversation and actually ensure loss and damage is being correctly and directly accounted for, particularly at a business level. What role, if any, should the private sector be playing in regards to loss and damage funding, along with the actual local actions that are required on the ground?
Yes, I think beside the loss and damage fund, there's this thing that we call the funding arrangement, that the money that we have is not sufficient, and then we have to explore more solutions, more innovative solutions to channel money and then bring it to where it should be. Actually, currently, for instance, if I take the example of the fossil fuel industry, for instance, they're making a lot of profits every year, billions and trillions over the lives of the vulnerable communities. This money that these companies are having, and then these companies mostly they are subsidized, for instance, by the states. For us, we are also calling to make like the polluters pay for these companies, this money that they're making, to be able to channel it and then to bring it to the loss and damage fund so that communities can also be supported. I think businesses have a very, very big role to play in this. In two cases, I'll just speak on two cases. First of all, there is very few connections between businesses and NGOs, and I think we need to create this connection so that businesses can actively participate in fighting the climate crisis by supporting a lot of NGOs as well who are on the ground. This is first. The second, it's for our national policies, I speak on a national level, that we should be able to enable the young people to create a very safe environment for entrepreneurship, to get the young people bring the innovative solutions to address this climate crisis. And this is lacking for many countries right now.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring this back round then to the role, to the theme of the day, and one which is a central theme of this episode of COP28 Covered, which is that of youth. It's clear that youth does have more of a presence at this COP. This pavilion that we're in now tells us that. But some are saying that this presence is a little bit sidelined, a bit disconnected from the central kind of priority conversations here. Mamadou, what have you made of this COP from a youth advocacy perspective? Do you feel the voices of youth and particularly indigenous youth communities are being platformed and heard enough here?
I would not say that they are heard enough. I think the youth are not disconnected to the conversations. It's the conversations that are disconnected basically to the youth. I'm sure like in these negotiations, if you brought the actual young people who are with the community, who are doing great work at the community level, if you brought them to the negotiation tables, all of the issues that have been discussed, we already had an outcome. But then the problem is that those actual people, the actual communities, those young people that are on the ground, that are working every day to address the climate crisis, they're sidelined, they're not brought to the table. And that makes it a bit difficult because the people that are taking the decisions are somehow a bit disconnected from what's happening on the ground. There are, of course, efforts, particularly at this COP. Since last year we had the Children and Youth Pavilion. At COP27 we have it equally this year, and then this COP also welcomed a lot of young people. But there's a lot of things to do, and then we need to move from this tokenistic participation, just bringing youth for the sake of bringing young people, but to have them in the decision-making tables. And I'm sure if we have them in those tables, all of the issues we are discussing right now will have breakthrough solutions.
Completely agree. And just finally then, a key element of this youth conversation, particularly at a global south level, is that of upskilling and education around climate change and sustainability and climate diplomacy. What are your thoughts on this? What can be done at a government and perhaps a business level to better educate and empower youth around climate action, particularly in the global south?
Yes, there are a lot of things to do. Now I'm very happy that more and more countries, for instance, are bringing young people in their negotiation teams, so young people can participate in the negotiations as well and propose policies. And this is an example of how we can bring young people in the discussions table. It's by inviting them to the negotiations, but also by supporting them in terms of skills, in terms of trainings, because these negotiations also, they have their specific languages, they have their specific codes, and then this needs a lot of training from the young people to be able to take part in this conversation. But regardless of that, young people are really doing awesome things, and they just need support and capacity building and trainings, and also support and then brought to the table.
Mamadou, thank you so much for your time today. As I say, there are a lot of lively discussions and conversations, and a lot of young people, even school children here involved in some of the sessions around us. And I know you're involved in a lot of them, and I know we were talking off air about the fact that you've got to head back yourself to Senegal and take part in your exams, which is exciting. Best of luck with those. I'll let you get back to it all, and I'm going to hand back over now to myself. Thank you very much to both Karim and Mamadou there, two inspirational chats for today's youth-focused episode. So back here to COP then, just a few days left of the negotiations, lots of questions still to be answered. Still one answered question for our podcast listeners here, because will there be another listener quiz or not? The sad news is, I fear not. But the good news is that apparently Sarah came up with a final new segment idea in place of the quiz on her flight home, just to keep things feeling fresh for us. Now, in all honesty, I have no idea what the segment is, so I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to deliver it up. Here's Sarah's special segment. Hopefully it will have a catchy title and a jingle to go with it.
Well, Luke, I'll spare everyone a jingle in my singing voice to avoid paying royalties, but for today I did want to turn the quiz into, drumroll please, Stock Take Story Time. We love hearing from our listeners, and we'd love to hear a bit more than just a one-word answer to our listener quiz questions. So if you're at COP right now, or you've been there in previous days, and you have a story or experience that really touched you and you think will entertain and inspire us, send it in and we'll reward the best with an eco voucher. I thought this was especially pertinent to do on Youth and Skills Day. We've already heard so many great stories from young people who, despite being fewer of their years than me, have accomplished more in terms of climate advocacy and capacity building than I ever have. So it would be great to hear what you've all been up to on the ground. So email your Stocktake story time to podcast@fav-house.com before tomorrow's episode, which will air on Saturday the 9th of December at about 5 p.m. UK time or 9 p.m. Dubai time. So back to you, Luke. I hope I've done this segment justice and not dropped you in it.
You've pulled me out of it, if anything, Sarah. So there we go, Stocktake story time. Let's do it. So send us in your inspirational COP stories. We're going to read out our best in the next episode. Email those short stories to podcast@fav-house.com. And so I think that's a wrap for this bumper episode of COP28 covered. The weekend's now approaching, but that means nothing here for Edie at COP28 because I will be back same time, same place tomorrow for our 10th episode of the show. And it's going to be another great one because we'll be delivering up a nature special with a couple of cracking interviews lined up. So happy Friday, everyone. I'm going to venture out of the COP walls now and see what Dubai has to offer on a Friday night. I'll then be back for that next episode tomorrow, 9th of December. And until then, it's a goodbye from Sarah, a goodbye from Matt, and a goodbye from me. Goodbye.